Buongiorno, anzi buonasera per coloro che ci seguono in diretta, bentrovati. Io sono Carlo Stagnaro, sono il direttore delle ricerche dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni e questa sera presenteremo un libro appena pubblicato dalla nostra casa editrice che è IBL Libri. È un libro scritto da Tom Palmer e Matt Warner, si intitola Sviluppo e dignità, autodeterminazione, decentramento e lotta alla povertà. È la traduzione italiana di un libro uscito un po' di tempo fa in inglese. Gli autori sono appunto Tom Palmer, che è vicepresidente e direttore delle attività internazionali della Fondazione Atlas, e Matt Warner, che è presidente della Fondazione Atlas. I just said that you are the president of the Atlas Foundation, and Tom Palmer is vice president and director for the international activities of the Atlas Foundation, and I would say a superhero in the freedom movement. Da ora in poi il seminario, questa discussione, questa intervista in diretta si svolgerà in inglese. Chiunque voglia intervenire può scriverci nei commenti sui canali da cui ci state seguendo per suggerirci delle domande che io rivolgerò a Matt Warner. So let me switch to English. And let's officially start tonight's conversation. Actually, tonight in Italy, but Matt is in the United States. Today, it's not. I mean, the morning is over. It's early afternoon, I think, over there. And by the way, this is a very peculiar day to have a conversation, given that the United States is deciding who the next president will be. But we will not talk about politics today. So first of all, thank you, Matt Warner, for being here, and especially thank you for writing this wonderful book.
Well, thank you, Carlo. I'm really pleased to be here. And, IBL has been a long time partner of Atlas Network, and we've been really pleased to see how you set a good standard of excellence in the network. And so the opportunity to collaborate with you is an honor. And you mentioned Tom Palmer as a superhero. I totally agree. And my advice to anyone who wants to write a book is to get him to co-author it with you, because that's a great security blanket that gives me confidence in what we put out.
Yes, and by the way, Tom has been a guest of IBL in several events in the past. I think this may be the first time we have you as our guest
I believe
in an
so.
Italian. Okay, so welcome in this case.
Thank you.
So let's start discussing the book. I mean, the book is a very nice and easy reading. It reads very well. Its goal, it's probably, I mean, on the one hand, to raise a number of points that are relevant for the freedom movement around the world, but on the other hand, also to provide the readers with tools to actually advance liberty. And one particular, oh, sorry, and one peculiarity of this book is that, differently from many other books about why liberty is good for progress and economic growth, it speaks about liberty, it speaks about economic freedom, but it starts by discussing a concept which is often absent in the economic literature, which is the concept of dignity. So my first question to you, to introduce today's conversation, is what do you mean by dignity, and why is dignity so important in discussing basically economic growth and prosperity?
Well, we wrote this book in the context of two observations. One is that the spread of liberal democracy as a governance preference has not gone as smoothly and as effectively as advocates of liberal democracy would hope. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was some optimism that this would be, as Fukuyama said, the end of history. And yet we find ourselves in more of a Samuel Huntington world, where there isn't unanimous appreciation for the institutions of liberal democracy. And so we've got to be curious about why that is and whether that implicates some adjustments on our part. And the second observation is that it's related to the first, but in promoting the idea of economic freedom, um, those who have been promoting markets and freedom have done a good job of making the efficiency arguments. But there's an opportunity for us to become more versatile and well-versed in moral arguments for a volunteer-based, peaceful collaboration that is the market. And so the idea of dignity, for me personally, was introduced to me from the books of Deirdre McCloskey and Joel Mokyr. And Tom Palmer started just before the pandemic to sort of raise the term dignity more and more. And so when the pandemic happened, we decided to try to make this argument that the future of promoting liberal democracy and economic freedom will be served well by further understanding the idea of dignity and how it has practical implications for human flourishing. And so a quick review is, the idea of dignity as a term historically was a way to sort of acknowledge higher rank in society. If you had dignity, it meant that you were of the, an upper class or afforded some sort of disposition of status by government. And a couple hundred years ago, that started to change, and the Enlightenment period led to formalizing a sense that every human has dignity in the sense that we have equal moral value, and that any institutional governance structure ought to acknowledge in principle and in practice this equality under the law. And so dignity became not just we care about humanity, but there's something valuable about wanting to see all individuals be self-determining. And the practical application of affording someone the dignity of choosing how to live their life the way they want is that when people in the complex system of society are free to make their own choices, this unlocks kind of a complex combinatorial solution that has given us economic growth and prosperity and leisure and all of these things that open up more time for arts and creativity and philosophy, etc. And so the first principle is dignity means no one of us should control another one of us. And so that's a moral argument. And then the practical argument is when people are self-determining, the organization that we observe as a result, that nobody really designed, no one person designed, is sort of the optimal solution in context for solving problems and creating wealth.
Yes, and you mentioned Deirdre McCloskey, who is also the author of the introduction or the preface to your book, and you follow very much Deirdre's reasoning in positing dignity as the basis or the engine, human dignity and personal and individual dignity as the engine behind what she calls the great enrichment, that is the unbelievable creation of wealth across the 19th century. Now, one of the chapters of your book traces a sort of intellectual history of the concept of dignity. And you show that the idea of dignity changed a lot over time, as you just mentioned, but it also changes depending on the country where you are, depending on the culture of each country. So in a way, promoting economic growth and promoting prosperity requires to promote a particular idea of dignity. How can you reconcile this with the idea that people who are who have born and who live within a culture may have a different view of what personal dignity or collective dignity means.
Sure. So one of the things that's a little challenging to reconcile intellectually, but we need to do it, is there's plenty of evidence to say that liberal democracy is, uh, for better or worse, the best, most moral system of governance that we've come up with so far. But we must also recognize that by nature, part of its success is probably rooted in the fact that it is not um, something that works well when it's imposed by the outside. The idea of liberal democracy fundamentally is that we should be free and self-determining. And so, whether with good intentions or bad intentions, the West, to use that term in its broadest sense, spent 40 years trying to spread liberal democracy through kind of an expert consultant model of sort of sticks and carrots, along with sort of expert hand-holding and architect, in engineering the transition to a liberal democracy in other countries. And one of the reasons why that's not, we now can appreciate why that's not a smart way to go, is that for many people in those countries, they experienced what was described as liberal democracy as a really negative experience. And this is because we copied and pasted institutions from one country to another, hoped that they would work. They didn't work. And so the results were disappointing. And as part of that, people had to swallow that, and they experienced it often as humiliation, that some Western experts are going to come and solve our problems for us. And then when that didn't work very well, then they say, as a brand, liberal democracy doesn't deliver, and so they look for something else. And the chaos that they experienced, I think, unfortunately, has made strongman politics or authoritarian leaning politics tempting, in order to establish some kind of predictable order. And so, really, this book is not really preaching to the unconverted. It's sharing some hypotheses with fellow advocates of liberal democracy that we've got to have a little bit of flexibility and humility when it comes to supporting the evolution and development of liberal democracy in other places. Because while cultural practices have practical consequences, they still must be accounted for and appreciated and understood in order to shift from existing norms and behaviors and cultural expectations to functioning institutions on the principles of liberal democracy. And that's a messy transition. And we don't like messy when we want to solve problems. We don't like non-linear paths to success. But we've got to embrace it. And the idea of dignity helps us do that, I think, because it reminds us that when you want to solve someone else's problem, inherent in that is some hubris. Even if you're well-intentioned, there's some hubris that says, I know better than you what you need in your life. And when it comes to establishing governance, it's just a risky track record. It's not that it never has positive impact. It's just that on net, we're seeing now almost 18 years of declining democratic norms around the world, and we've got to challenge ourselves to think differently. So what's the solution to that? It's there isn't one silver bullet, but appreciating organizations like yours who are part of civil society, promote ideas that you seek to persuade people with. You're not seeking to use military force or other forms of government coercion to establish what you want. You're trying to persuade people in a certain context, and you represent that context. You're not an outsider to the evolution of institutional ideas and political governance in Italy. And so the broader international community is trying to appreciate more. They call it localization, is trying to appreciate the role of local civil society actors in shaping the future of their governments. Um, but it's raising a lot of questions, and people are we're all in the middle of trying to learn as much as we can about what to do differently going forward.
Yes, let me play the devil's advocate in a way. Um, well, you are speaking about dignity as the cornerstone of prosperity and human flourishing. And at the same time, you are a free market activist. You believe that, I mean, you, Tom, and the Atlas Foundation believe in the power of free markets. Now, a government interventionist might object that in order to provide human beings with a full recognition of their dignity and personal and individual dignity, there needs to be some form of government intervention that empowers them, for example, by freeing them from the need to work very hard in order to make their day, or free them from other forms of needs. So, how would you respond to the idea that in order to provide people with dignity, the state has to step in and to uh, help them to survive by creating various kinds of social policies?
Yeah, so here I think the work of Eleanor Ostrom is really helpful, a Nobel laureate who studied, um, most famously, helped us understand better the commons and behaviors around public goods, but also the idea that formal government institutions have a relationship with the informal norms that preceded them or continued to complement them. And so by that I mean the way people in a particular place currently behave, what complexity scientists would call initial conditions. How, if you want to change the way a society functions, you've got to understand the way it's functioning now. And so the ideal is to transition into a government that the people have supported, that does the key minimum functions well and correctly. They adjudicate disputes in the marketplace in a predictable way using rule of law with impartial judges. They protect private property rights. They respond and address fraud. There are key functions in a that a government needs to do correctly, consistently, and well. And some refer to this as state capacity or state capability, and there are people who don't like that term because if they're like me, they are sort of skeptical of strengthening government. But as Tom has often said, we do want the marketplace regulated in the sense that it's regular, that we know the rules, we know that there are consequences for breaking the rules, and the rules apply to all of us equally. Now, there's no society where we've perfectly mastered that premise, but we are all endeavoring in a pluralistic, democratic way to move in that direction. For any given country, where they are is both a function of what's happening right now, but also their history. So dignity doesn't mean that whatever system of government, whatever cultural practices, it doesn't matter. They're all equal because we respect everyone equally. That's just empirically untrue. There's different arrangements that have different kinds of consequences. And but what the idea of dignity helps us appreciate is that there are limits to what the government interventionists can achieve through centralized power. There are real limits to solutions that can be solved through a centralized mechanism, which we sort of agree is the remit of a government that we empower and allow to govern us, but only with our consent. I mean, that's the ideal. And so, and we're all practicing and experimenting with different ways of trying to have that go smoothly. And the key thing that I'm arguing is, again, not that there's not a standard or there's not a goal or there's not a shared agreed upon priority or optimal outcome. I am unapologetically pro-liberal democracy as a set of principles and ideas that work best. The way that we get there, we go from A to B for a given country. We've just got to be more thoughtful about the role that local knowledge and local preferences and local attitudes play into what changes are made. Because if you do it the way that we've been doing it for 40 years, which is for the most part ignoring local knowledge, ignoring local preferences, not thinking that that has anything to do with the solution that we're building, it's going to come back to bite us.
One argument you make, therefore, is that if you want to help a country to develop, you should not go there and give them, I mean, trying to build their own institutions from the outside. Another topic you deal with is the idea that to help poor countries to become wealthier, we should transfer them money in order to build up capital or capital stocks in those countries, which is the basis of how foreign aid has been designed in the past few decades. So why do you think that this is not the solution to underdevelopment or to lack of development?
Well, because development is a function of productivity, and capital on its own does not make itself productive. And what is productive is context sensitive. So the idea that just having money is, or having assets is the way that future accumulation of growth happens, totally misunderstands the importance of that problem-solving mechanism that economic freedom introduces in the way that it decentralizes decisions. Maybe a way to illustrate this is in a smaller setting. I do change or organizational change consulting, and some consultants come in to help an organization with expertise and best practices, and the job is, I'm going to teach you these things, you should implement them, and then you'll have these successes. That, I think, is now too outdated and simplistic to think in those terms. In terms of best practice, if you think about what best practice is, it's the idea that on average, for most organizations, this tends to work pretty well. That doesn't have a lot of nuance to it. It doesn't have a lot of flexibility to it. So the kind of consulting I do is to come in and support a process by which that organization can have its own conversations and determine its own solutions, and to make that an effective process for them with some self-imposed accountability on what they're going to change. That's very different from a model, I'd call that finding best fit as opposed to adopting best practice. And if you think about the development of liberal democracy as a priority around the world, we've got to get out of the idea that there's one best practice that everybody should adopt, and instead seek to discover the best fit for that time and place and that particular stage of an institution's evolution. It's unsatisfying to we're all a little bit attracted to a simple solution or one big idea that solves everything. But we've got enough experimental evidence now from people trying that It's just not the right way to approach problems when you're dealing with real people whose lives will be affected. They need to have some say, not just because we respect them, although we do, but because there's something useful about what they know that we can't know.
Now, your book, I mean, we've been discussing so far one aspect of your book, which is let's say, its theoretical side or the moral arguments you develop, but the book is also an unbelievable collection of stories, of personal and individual stories. Some of them were successful. I like to mention the story. I liked particularly the story of Papa Coriandre, who is a guy who could, I mean, leverage upon some reform that were implemented in Burundi, where he lives, to unlock his ingenuity and create an unbelievable value by selling his products. But you also tell a number of unsuccessful stories, in some cases tragic stories, such as the story of Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself to fire in Tunisia because bureaucrats abused their powers and prevented him from doing what he wanted to do and from doing his work. Uh, one, one thing that strikes about all of these stories is that in some cases, human dignity and personal and economic freedom are protected by the law or are not protected by the law. But in other cases, while the law formally protects individual freedom, actually power abuses from politicians or from bureaucrats or from other powerful persons actually violate the principles of human dignity. Now, this long story to ask a question which is particularly interesting, I think, for all of those who are involved somehow in the freedom movement around the world. That is, it's relatively easy for us to identify formal institutional changes that may be needed in a particular country, such as Italy. You make this reform, and by doing so, you will allow some value creation and so on and so forth. It's much harder to identify the cases where human dignity is violated, not because of what the law formally says, but because of the way law is actually implemented or not implemented in the reality. How, what do you think can we do in order to address this second kind of problem?
One of the things I'm most encouraged by recently, and one thing I should always acknowledge is at Atlas Network is a nonprofit. We're headquartered near Washington, D.C. We benefit from the opportunity to observe and learn from 550 civil society, non-government organizations around the world in 100 plus countries. And so we see trends happening among organizations that are leading on these questions. And something that I think the dignity mindset naturally leads to is think tanks who have policy priorities aren't just developing their policy priorities based on their own ideas and preferences sitting around together in a closed room, but are getting out and developing relationships with the people and the organizations that are related to the communities that they want to see thrive. So I've seen organizations spending time in low income areas, talking to people about what are your biggest challenges? In what ways do you think government rules get in the way of your prosperity? Where are you frustrated? And what that helps us do is understanding context, not just which things are out of whack, but the relative magnitudes. If I'm just thinking theoretically based on, the books I love to read and the thinkers that I love, I might come up with a laundry list of things that, looking at the text of law in a place, I would want to change. We've seen, we refer to it as the Washington Consensus, this list of reforms that we've tried to convince others to adopt. and we've incentivized to adopt through, um, you know, uh, a lot of carrots, right? This idea of providing aid in exchange for them adopting these rules. But what happens is those rules get adopted on paper, and because again, the nature of institutional change is a pluralistic experience, and it benefits from being a social experience and not just a technical change on paper. And so, for example, right now, it's estimated 60% of all workers in the world operate in the informal sector. Um, Papa Coriander was one of them. He had a micro business. He was doing well, but the barriers for him becoming a formal business were too high, both the formal and the informal. So the formal is, the fees and the number of government authorities who have to approve to give you a business license is prohibitive for most people who need to make money every day to survive. Um, Simplifying those processes, um, the exact way to do it is informed by local actors who are championing these things and working with the government to do it. And you see big results that way. And so I think the idea of where does a think tank get its policy priorities, we are enriching ourselves by being more open-minded for the sources of influence for what those could be. Now you can go spend time with groups working on poverty solutions that are advancing things that you don't think are going to work, or that you, based on your own sort of academic understanding, don't see it as the highest and best use of our time and resources. But we can still learn something from those organizations, who don't have the sensitivities and sensibilities that some of us have. So that combination of filtering through people's experiences and trying to identify ways that a bad government policy in practice is oppressive. Then we can begin to have a more intelligent strategy, and a built-in support system for achieving change, because we've already validated that this in practice is something that is is stifling economic freedom.
Yes, let me ask you a question that we get from the public. Uh, Someone asks, why did it take so long for Western economists, experts, and policymakers to understand that they or we should rely on local expertise in developing countries rather than going there and imposing our own solutions?
Um, I think there's a lot of ways to understand this, but I also think it's also not very surprising. I mean, I spent a few years paying attention to the international development community, attending the conferences, speaking on some of their panels, having a lot of meetings, just to try to understand where where things were going in that space. And there's a lot of people of goodwill who are in the system and know it's broken. Um, Knowing that these large multilateral organizations, World Bank, USAID, IMF, knowing that they need to change and achieving that change are so different, right? It is difficult to, I think the very nature of the relationship between taxpayer-funded organizations who want to do this kind of work, I think they're always going to have a tension that is going to undermine their chances of success, because they have to show that they know what they're doing and they have to show results, and that lends itself to taking control of the situation. And what we're seeing now is that while rhetorically localization is very popular, in practice, it requires ceding some control, and I don't see that happening in practice. So I think it's very natural for people who want to do good and to solve problems. The last thing that they're predisposed to entertain is that their own role in the problem solving, their own role intervening might be undermining the overall probability of success. And that's just a difficult thing to consider and even more difficult to accept. And so it's saying you've devoted your life to solving the world's biggest problems. Have you considered that you are the problem? That's a hard thing to consider and even harder to accept. But I think we all need to balance our desire for certitude with appreciation for the complexity of the emerging nature of human affairs. Part of the trade-off in democracy is that uh, it's not just your own freedom, it's other people's freedom that you're fighting for. And they might use their freedom in a way that's very different from the way you want to use yours. And it gets messy in practice.
Yeah, going back to the initial discussion about institutions, uh, you mentioned several times in our conversation the concept of liberal democracy, and you talk a lot about it in the book as well. Um, Liberal democracy, though, has its own fragilities and its own enemies, both from the outside and from the inside. One of the inside enemies that you talk about is authoritarian populism. Uh, that you say is a threat, not just in developing countries with fragile institutions, but it may also be a threat in established Western democracies. What do you mean by authoritarian populism, and why do you think it's an actual threat today?
Well, I think one of the paradigm shifts that happens when people are particularly frustrated and lose faith in the system is that instead of looking at politics in a liberal democracy as um, we are campaigning to take our turn as stewards of this enterprise, uh, during which time we have some good ideas that we want to advance, to one of we are campaigning to take control over our enemies, so that we can dominate them before they dominate us. And when you start to get the slippery slope of losing trust in your institutions, people naturally gravitate towards who cares how we win? We just need to win. The stakes are so high. And our quote unquote enemies, fellow citizens who think differently than us, um, um, have to be stopped by any means necessary. So you lose sight of the pluralist model of saying, look, what we want are liberal institutions and enumerated powers that otherwise constrain our government. And the most reliable way, as messy as it is, for us to get and maintain those is through pluralist democratic means. Because otherwise, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We sometimes do this thought exercise. Hey, if you were king for a day, what five laws would you change or whatever? And that's fine as a thought experiment. But even the most politically simpatico person that I respect, I don't want that person to be an authoritarian, have that power. Um, I think it's tempting because we have seen examples where authoritarians do the right policy. But what we're talking about is not, little wins here and there. We are talking about what is on net the most consistent, principled, long-term, uh, enduring way for us to protect as much human freedom as possible. And what that leads us to conclude uh, is we have to take the responsibility to lead through persuasion and through also being open to learning. I think the way that we advance these ideas changes over time as we learn and develop better understanding, and there's new research and there's new experiences to draw upon. And so we have to be careful. You know, I'm attracted to a lot of libertarian ideas, and I think that's always a good starting point for understanding an issue. Um, but in practice, I would never sign on to, uh, you know, using force to establish a libertarian utopia. That's antithetical. So uh, we need to persuade, we need to understand, and then we have to respect in any specific instance whose prerogative is it to make this decision. And if I'm not a citizen of another country, absolutely we should be learning from each other and visiting and exchanging ideas and giving advice. But who has the prerogative to decide? And our power structures have been such that it's been too often outsiders who have the authority to decide. And if that worked, that would be, one thing, but it doesn't even work.
Yes, I think we have one last country from one last question from one of our followers from Facebook. We are broadcasting this on several channels, of course, and they ask, first of all, what do you think about the idea of friendshoring? That is the idea that you should only trade or preferably trade with friend countries rather than with the rest of the world in general. And whether you think that the growth of populism could trigger the adoption of friendshoring within development programs, and so what do you think about it?
That's a great question. I've been following some of the human rights activist activities that are doing some good research to better understand the coordination that's happening among authoritarian countries and authoritarian leaning countries, to understand the threat that they pose in that coordination. I'm sympathetic to sort of a diverse brainstorm uh, about ways that we can counter this problem. I tend to be a little slow to sign on to establishing government rules related to trade. Um, I think, for example, in the environmental movement, I think we sometimes don't acknowledge or appreciate how much impact those who have been advocating for the environment have had through persuasion and changing behaviors. Um, I don't have a lot of faith in political solutions to some environmental problems, but I see a lot of us as humans make choices that align with our values. And so if you can persuade people about values, I think that's very valid. If making the argument that we shouldn't trade with a certain country, that argument can be shared either in the context of trade policy or in the context of consumer behavior. So I think we have a couple of different tools to discuss these issues, uh, and in anytime we institute trade policy, there's it's always a trade-off. So we have to weigh those trade-offs. If we protect producers, then we're harming consumers. If we protect consumers, then we're harming producers. So we have to be careful about those things. But I am sympathetic to this sort of new era of coordination among authoritarian countries, and I think a lot of discussion about what to do is warranted.
So thank you very much for your time, and especially even more so, thank you very much for the time you took to write the book with Tom Palmer. Let me switch again to Italian per ringraziare tutti coloro che ci hanno seguito. Vi ricordo che Matt Warner, che è il presidente della Fondazione Atlas, è l'autore insieme a Tom Palmer del libro Sviluppo e dignità. autodeterminazione e decentramento nella lotta alla povertà, pubblicato da IBL Libri. Potete trovarlo su tutte le principali piattaforme online, potete trovarlo direttamente sullo shop del sito dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni e, come si dice, potete trovarlo in tutte le migliori librerie. Come sempre vi ricordo, se vi è piaciuta la discussione di oggi, se l'avete trovata interessante, di mettere il like, iscrivervi ai nostri canali, condividerla sui social networks e inviarla ad amici e conoscenti. Grazie davvero di essere stati con noi anche oggi. Thank you, Matt, for your time with us, and see you next time.
Thank you, Carlo.